Tragically, on October 31st, 1956, Mary McCartney died shortly after an operation for breast cancer at Liverpool's Northern Hospital. Paul was only 14, Mike just 12. The week of the funeral, Paul and Mike went to stay with their Auntie Gin, their father having no wish for them to see him so badly broken up. Not surprisingly, after Mary died, life on Forthland Row was far different for the McCartneys. Jim, of course, was now forced to be both breadwinner and full-time housekeeper. Although his sisters Mill and Gin helped out when and where they could, it was still a terrible strain on the 53-year-old salesman. As children, neither of the boys really showed any special interest in music. His first instrument, a low-budget acoustic, soon became the overriding force in his life. It's funny, he says, but everyone remembers their first string box. Mine was a Zenith. I'd no idea where it was going to lead at the time. I just started bashing away and pretty soon had all the basic chords well and truly learned. Then I got a bit more ambitious and bought a solid Rosati, a Lucky 7. It only had 2 strings, and when I played it, it didn't really produce a very melodic sound. But I kept the volume right down, and it seemed okay to me. In an exclusive 1984 interview conducted by this author at a posh Liverpool eatery, Mike McCartney, who after the Beatles' first hit officially changed his last name to McGear, recalled he and Paul's early musical influences.
In our old days, we were flipped out listening to every word, because our kid and I used to be at the Everly Brothers. Listen to every word, every nuance, every sort of feeling to get it exactly right. Little Richard, our kid, did Little Richard, learned it very quickly, and one of the few white people that Little Richard is acknowledged as being a good interpreter of him.
Along with McCartney's interest in the guitar came a growing awareness of rock and roll. Before long, it wasn't just the music that had captured his imagination, but the whole freewheeling rock lifestyle as well. Hopping on board the bus for the dreamy half-hour morning ride to school, McCartney soon made friends with the driver's son, George Harrison, who, like McCartney, was smitten with the guitar. The two soon started hanging out together after school and inevitably began the thankless job of teaching themselves the new chords necessary to carry forward their boyish fantasies of one day playing in a big group. Those fantasies, however, would soon move a major step closer to reality. Paul McCartney's fortuitous first meeting with John Lennon officially took place on July 6, 1957, at a garden fete at St. Peter's Parish Church. That year, as a concession to the basically church-shy teenage youth of Woolton, a local group of lads known as the Quarrymen were slated to appear. Performing mostly covers of well-known rock and skiffle tunes, the 5 young men jived their way through a rapid-fire repertoire of numbers ranging from Maggie May to Railroad Bill and Cumberland Gap. Mixed into the happily swaying crowd that afternoon was Paul McCartney, who'd come along for the day at the suggestion of Ivan Vaughan, a mutual friend of both John and Paul. After the Quarrymen's swinging first set, Ivan led Paul across the road to the band's impromptu dressing room in St. Peter's Church Hall. "This is John," Vaughan ventured upon entering the large, sweltering room. "Hi," replied Lennon. "This is Paul." A rather ordinary beginning, perhaps, but within minutes things heated up when it was discovered that McCartney not only played a pretty mean left-handed guitar, but, wonder of wonders, could actually correctly tune one as well. 2 weeks later, while cycling along Menlove Avenue in Woolton, McCartney ran into Shotton, who offhandedly announced that John had been talking about him and wondered if he would like to join the band. Delicately balancing against the curb on his bike, McCartney reflected for a moment or two and then replied simply, "Okay then, see you," before shoving off back across the golf course to the willowy wilds of Allerton. McCartney was naturally pretty excited, inwardly anyway. Externally, though, he was typically nonchalant, hardly mentioning a word to anyone at home that night about his big break. During this time, Paul was still quite friendly with George Harrison, who, despite his tender years, impressed McCartney with his strong musical presence and stirring guitar licks, a commodity very much missing from the often musically ad hoc Quarrymen. Oscillating between the potential harm admitting Harrison to the group might have on Lennon's carefully crafted tough guy teddy boy image and the obvious benefits of bringing on board a lad of such superior musicianship, Lennon finally relented when, on February 6, 1958, he agreed to hear what George could do. Being a quarryman, however, was not all adolescent merriment. Perpetually short of money and places to play, several times the group almost folded for good. When, on July 15, 1958, John's mother, Julia Lennon, was knocked down and killed by a car on Menlove Avenue, the effect on John was catastrophic, as Mike remembers.
Yeah, it was after my mum died. I wiped John out. I remember that. We got much closer, him and I. And of course our kid and him.
Casting off the extraneous quarrymen along the way, the group was now down to 3 hardcore members: John, Paul, and George. Any sort of reasonable drummer, as usual, was almost impossible to find or to keep. Way back in 1963, McCartney recounted the initial formation of the Quarrymen.
It's a funny story, really. It was back, it was back in the old days. We were all at school together, really. We grew up as school teenage buddies and things. But it developed from there, really. George and I were at school together, and John was at the school next door, and Ringo was at Butlins. And we just started playing guitars and things. And it went on from there, really, as far as I'm concerned.
By the fall of 1959, John had finally dropped the name Quarrymen for the more celestial-sounding Moondogs, and then Johnny and the Moondogs. It was during an onstage audition for British television personality Carol Levis, probably on October 18th, that the boys first used the name. And although they made it into the finals, appearing for 2 successive auditions at the Liverpool Empire and the Hippodrome Theatres in Manchester, they were not ultimately chosen to appear on Levis's show. Lennon invited his art school chums Stuart Ferguson Victor Sutcliffe, or simply Stu, to join the band. Although a brilliant painter and designer, Sutcliffe made no pretense about being any sort of musician and was therefore obliged to pick up the bass as he went along, a learning experience that certainly didn't ingratiate him to the ever-perfectionist McCartney. By April of 1960, things were finally beginning to perk up for the band. At this point, still the Silver Beatles, the boys snagged a solid 2 weeks' work backing Johnny Gentle on a ballroom tour of Scotland. Encouraged by what for them was at least a taste of real work, they came home feeling like genuine musicians, even if their pockets were still basically just as empty as ever. "Someone actually asked me for my autograph," Paul wrote home to his dad from Inverness. "I signed for them, too, 3 times. From that day on, Jim McCartney later remarked, things were never quite really the same. Contrary to popular belief, the Beatles' initial trek to Germany came about more as a result of a lack of alternatives than any great success in England. Thinking they had been booked at Hamburg's popular Kaiserkeller through small-time Liverpool promoter Alan Williams, they later discovered they were actually slated to appear as the new house band at the Indra, a seedy, low-life strip club at 34 Gross Freiheit. Just prior to setting off, Paul McCartney rang up local drummer Pete Best on the spur of the moment and invited him to join the group as a quick fix to the Beatles' ongoing percussion problems. There was, however, still one major stumbling block to be overcome before the 5 eager young men could pile into Williams' battered old green minivan and make for Germany: Jim McCartney. Aware that his no-nonsense dad would never allow such an apparently foolhardy venture without a great deal of convincing, Paul cleverly recruited the assistance of his brother. Despite Mike's best efforts, his father remained stubbornly unmoved, and so Alan Williams went on to paint a picture of the lovely Germanic scenery, good steady wages, and a chance for his son to experience new, meaningful horizons. In other words, he laid it on thick. The reality, however, was rather grim. When the boys first arrived, they were put up not in the comfortable, homey guest houses that had been promised back home, but rather 3 dank, seamy rooms with bunk beds behind the movie screen at the Bambi Cinema at 33 Paul Rosenstrasse. The Beatles' first stint in Hamburg ended on November 21st, 1960, when George Harrison was deported by immigration officials for working in a nightclub under the age of 18. Making their way back to Liverpool, within days Paul had reluctantly landed a proper job as a delivery boy for something called Speedy Prompt Delivery Service in Liverpool. Hand in hand with the Beatles' rapidly rising popularity began the manic adulation which was later to become the true hallmark of Beatlemania. Cavern Club compere and Beatles intimate Bob Wooler recalls the attendant hargy-bargy of securing the group's first gig at the legendary Liverpool Club on Matthew Street.
I joined the Cavern then at lunchtimes only, and I had been on to Ray McFall, the owner of the Cavern, about this group, the Beatles. I was really rooting for them. And I said to him, furthermore, Ray, they are able to play lunchtimes because they don't work during the day, you see. So they are what we'd call pro. So they were available.
Or unemployed.
Exactly. Well, I didn't want to say that now at this juncture. So he eventually went along. He wasn't a very easy person to get through to. Now, if you think I am sort of prim and proper, you should meet Ray. Eventually, he agreed, and they played a lunchtime session. And there were 5 Beatles, they got £6. So, Neil Aspel made the 6. They always regarded him as being part of the group. That's why, of course, he went to Apple with them.
The Beatles' second trip to Hamburg commenced on Friday, March 24th, 1961. Their salary was a duly modest 35 Deutschmarks per bobbing Beatle. Not a fortune by any means, but mixed in with the many attractive perks the boys enjoyed on the Reeperbahn, it was enough to scrape by. The Beatles' second trip to Hamburg ended on July 2nd, 1961, after their twice-extended contract finally came to an end. 9 days later, Paul McCartney was comfortably back home with his father and brother, enthusiastically plotting for the future. Alistair Taylor, Brian Epstein's personal assistant throughout the Beatle years, remembers how Epstein first crossed paths with the Fabs.
And this guy, Raymond Jones, came in and asked us to get this record, which we did, from Germany. And we got a box of 25, then another 25, and they just kept selling as fast as we could import them. And then a few weeks later we went down to meet this group at the Cavern, or to hear them, and took it from there. They were sensational. I hated pop music at that time. I was into jazz and classics, like I still am. But they were just so fantastic. Not necessarily musically, they were bloody awful, actually, musicians then. And they just had something else. They had charisma. I call it ingredient X. I don't know what it is. But they had it. We were enthusiastic, he was, and we went for lunch that same day, and we sat and we talked and what we should do. But I think that the great excitement came a little later when it dawned on him that he'd signed them. It was just something new. It was fun.
Now securely under the tutelage of Brian Epstein, the Beatles cut a significantly more professional image, due in large part to their new manager's well-honed sense of style and passion for the theatrical. Henceforth, they were strictly forbidden to swear, chew gum, or, God forbid, drink or eat on stage. Prohibitions particularly irksome to the naturally rebellious Lennon. McCartney, on the other hand, ever the promoter, clearly saw the wisdom of it all and actively encouraged the group to toe the line. At least until we get what we want, he would mutter under his breath to John. Father Tom Mackenzie, an early Beatles compere, recalls the group's first grotty gigs around Liverpool.
In 1962, the Beatles came to the hall. Now, I remember something being said to me about the Beatles. The chap says, "This is a different type of group, Mr. Mackenzie," a local lad this was. And I said, "Well, what do you mean by a different type of group?" Well, he said they wear leathers, and they look like a bit rough on the stage, When they came, Brian Epstein had just taken them over. Brian had taken them out of the leathers, and they were wearing ordinary suits then. And they went down well, but they were only doing a second spot with a group called the Hollies. And in those days, they were just about equivalent in status. I reckon their pay must have been about, in 62, about £12 for the gig, for the four of them.
It was these new improved Beatles who jetted off to Hamburg on April 10th, 1962 to begin their third stint on the Reaper bomb. This time, thanks to Epstein's fastidious advanced planning and skillful PR, they would play the Star Club, then one of Hamburg's most upmarket, high-paying venues. Just as they were about to leave for Speke Airport, however, an urgent telegram was received from Astrid. Cut down at the Kirsch's home in Altona, Stu was rushed by ambulance to the hospital, unconscious and only barely alive. He never made it, dying en route, cradled in Astrid's arms. The devastating news hit the Beatles like a bomb. John burst into hysterical laughter, unable to stop. George became predictably quiet, while Paul, despite his long record of run-ins with the former Beatle, appeared genuinely shocked and upset. So did Pete. That same day, Paul, Pete, and John flew on to Germany, meeting Astrid at the airport for a somber, tearful reunion. George, Brian, and Millie Sutcliffe, meanwhile, arrived the next afternoon, joining Astrid and the other three for an unusually demonstrative, emotionally charged encounter in the arrivals lounge. An urgent telegram was received from Brian Epstein in London on May 9th, 1962, after he had finally secured a provisional recording contract for the group with Parlophone. "Congratulations, boys. EMI request recording session. Please rehearse new material." The four young men were on top of the world. This was it, the big break they had all been waiting for, and Eppie had made it happen. Upon their return from Hamburg 7 weeks later, the boys immediately began to ready themselves for their London trip, whittling down to a fine point their already razor-sharp musical instincts during a private, closed-door practice session at the Cavern the first week of June. Several days later, Brian and the boys arrived at EMI House, Manchester Square, London, to sign their contract. Though strictly provisional, if the sessions turned out well and the music and material measured up, the Beatles had themselves a deal. 48 hours later, they were bounding up the stone steps of No. 3 Abbey Road, St. John's Wood, to meet producer George Martin and begin work on what would eventually become their very first single, Love Me Do, backed by the romantic ballad P.S. I Love You. Pete Best, long regarded as the group's handsomest and sexiest member, was soon to experience an excruciatingly cruel twist of fate. Today, Mike McCartney looks back fondly on Pete for the gentleman that he is, and seeks to clear up many of the myths surrounding his sacking from the group.
The big thing with those people was the sense of humor. And Pete was another direction. He wasn't... Bob Wooler had the best description of Pete, and that's the moody, magnificent Pete Best. He was moody and did this sort of James Dean image because he was that mentally, that's what he was. But they weren't. They were ahead. They were like fighting sort of quick and on the streets level, get on down. And Pete was very moody and magnificent, good looking, and the girls screamed for it. And if you're joking, that was an asset. They wouldn't have sacked the sod for that. It's basically down to the drumming ability in there. And there were a few drummers around Liverpool, and I used to go home and tell our kid about Ringo. I was just seeing with Rory Stone. I say, hey, that guy with, he didn't think about ugly or white streak or those things weren't in it. It was just like, that guy with Rory is an inventive drummer. He goes around the drums, right? He doesn't just hit it. He invents. He moves around the drum kit, and he's unusual. He feels it. He's different and can deliver the goods. Pete was all right, but it was just fate that decreed that, you know, something's got to happen, and somebody's got to go, and it's not us. You know, they could have been, any one of them could have been the one that fate chose to go. But George could have been the one, you know? Wasn't that? None of them were that fucking strong. They were all bloody you know, but when they got together, and that's when the magic happened.
Paddy Delaney, doorman at the Cavern, remembers that even though the Beatles had at last made a real record, they were still perpetually skint.
I lent Paul McCartney a halfpenny. He didn't have enough money. He didn't have any money at all. It was just after they made the record Please Please Me. They won a weekly salary from Brian Epstein. I think it was about £8, if I'm not mistaken. Paul went to the snack bar to buy himself a bottle of Coke, a cheese sandwich, but he didn't have enough money. He paid for the Coke, which, if I remember correctly, was 9p. So I was talking to a group of people. He came up to me and said, "Excuse me, you got a halfpenny on you?" I said, "Yes." "Yeah, Paul, yes, sure. Don't forget me when you're at the top of the rest of them. You owe me a halfpenny." Yeah. I said, "Yeah, I won't forget, Pat. I won't forget."
Following Please Please Me, From Me to You scored big for the Beatles, giving them yet another #1 tune on April 26, 1963. Their next musical coup, the hard-driving boy-girl mantra She Loves You, rocketed to the top of the Melody Maker singles chart on September 7, 1963. Written by Lennon and McCartney in the music room of Jane Asher's parents' house in London, the wild success of She Loves You proved once and for all that the Beatles had real staying power as artists. After all, 3 successive top-flight #1 singles could hardly be called a fluke.
It used to be a lot quicker to record. You know, we recorded the first Beatles album in a day. 10 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, and we did Twist and Shout last because if we'd have done it first we couldn't have done any of the others, you know, John's voice would have gone. So, you know, 1 day for an album, which, you know, is pretty fast.
At the end of November, their 5th single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, was released in England and shot directly to #1. A few days later, the group's 2nd LP, With the Beatles, also came out, amassing immediate advance orders of 2.5 million. Not even Elvis had ever been able to do that. The latter half of the 60s saw McCartney increasingly concerned with the pursuit of serious art. Although John Lennon had the reputation of being the artistic member of the group, it should be noted that the inspiration and planning for the albums Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Magical Mystery Tour, much of the White Album, and the operatic side 2 of Abbey Road belong almost solely to McCartney. Of the many McCartney classics evident on Sgt. Pepper, certainly one of the most memorable was the musically inspired romp When I'm 64. McCartney remembers the song's inception.
I wrote that song when I was about 16. So 64 was a long way off then. Right now, it's not so far off. I think, you know, I hope I'll just be happy. I'll have a great birthday. Birthday greetings, bottle of wine. And I hope Linda will feed me and will need me when I'm 64.
In 1983, executive Beatles minder Peter Brown recounted the unusual creation of the promotional film to accompany the Pepper masterpiece, A Day in the Life.
It was a mess. The guy that arranged it, or was supposed to set up the session, was called Vic Singh, who was involved with Wonderwall. And it was Vic Singh and Paul that set the whole thing up, and it was actually, they filmed the last session of it, which was the session with the London Symphony Orchestra. And, you know, as everyone went to the session, most of us were given 16mm hand mics, you know, and told to film whatever we liked. But what had no provision had been made for by Vic Singh or Paul was the fact that there was any straight film taking, you see. So everything that was done was just off the wall. And there was nothing really long enough to, you know, just people playing around with cameras. And so therefore, instead of having one person who would do basic footage, there wasn't anything usable. There were a lot of people at that session, Mick and Marianne, and I think Donovan, and they gave the orchestra, Paul bought them beer and paper mask just so that they wouldn't be uptight symphony musicians, and tried to kind of mellow them and mess them up a bit and give them a kind of jolly feeling. And so therefore they got a little drunk and wore paper faces.
Long after John, George, and Ringo had retreated to the staid placidity of London's pastoral suburbs, McCartney was burning the midnight oil with the likes of junkie author William Burroughs, beat poet Allen Ginsberg, heralded LSD manufacturer Michael Hollingshead, International Times founder Barry Miles, and Marianne Faithfull's husband John Dunbar, who owned and operated the celebrated Indica Gallery and Bookstore on Southampton Row. For a while, the privacy and freedom afforded the Beatles by their rejection of the road was a breath of fresh air for the stressed-out quartet. After 5 frantic years of being together night and day, often for months on end, each of them now had the option of wandering off on his own for a while. Following the unbridled success of their films A Hard Day's Night and Help, the Beatles' music became noticeably more introspective, interesting, and intricate. As early as Rubber Soul, Paul McCartney had asserted his colossal talent for melding strong lyrics with widely appealing melodies, as in songs such as You Won't See Me and I'm Looking Through You. Perhaps one of the Beatles' greatest albums, Revolver, further showcased McCartney as a musical painter with a wonderfully full and varied palette. Here, for the first time, emerges a truly compassionate Paul, wounded by an uncaring world that capriciously casts aside the broken and lonely as he portrays an Eleanor Rigby in The Hauntingly Beautiful for No One. On Thursday, August 24th, just a couple of days prior to Brian Epstein's tragic death from an accidental overdose of sleeping pills, he and the Beatles met to discuss the group's plans for the rest of the year. He is said to have been very keen about Paul's idea for the Magical Mystery Tour film and advised his charges to carry on with their plans. Within 3 days, however, Brian Epstein was dead. Thrown into a tailspin by this totally unexpected turn of events, the Beatles decided to postpone further work on the film until they returned from a 3-month meditation course they had promised to attend at the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's Rishikesh ashram. A few days later, however, they changed their minds, reasoning that it would make more sense to postpone their holidays until after filming had been completed. One of the most profoundly outrageous groups of the late 60s was certainly the innovative Bonzo Dog Doodah Band. Best remembered for their debut album Gorilla and their one-off hit single I'm the Urban Spaceman, few people realized that they were also the house band in the Magical Mystery Tour film. In the late 80s, I tracked down members of the now long-defunct group and gathered their recollections on the Mystery Tour and McCartney's production of their song Urban Spaceman. Bonzo Dog Man Roger Ruskinspear remembers.
John Lennon had seen the New Order band, and they wanted a funny band for Magical Mystery Tour, their nightclub scene. And Mike McCartney said, no, because we knew the scaffold from university shows and things, because the scaffold was sort of bubbling under, and we were bubbling under, and bands that bubble under sort of tend to meet in these universities, and we were always sort of doing the same stuff. So Mike McGeer said to his brother, no, you want the Bonzos, you don't want the vaudeville band, and they said, well, who are these Bonzos? Never heard of them, So we got the job on Magical Mystery Tour, and that's how we sort of met. And then we were asked to the party and the show. Wow, John Lennon personally asked for us, and we were up north doing some wretched club, and our management rang up and said, oh, you've been invited to the Beatles party, and they want you to perform, and unfortunately you can't go because you're in Worthington or somewhere. So complete explosions went on, and we booked, we just went, and we had Brian Somerville, publicist, said, oh, the guys have got to do it, I'd never be able to get a publicity party together like this, In fact, so we moved heaven and earth. It cost us a fortune, but we went down and did it.
Bonzo alumni Neil Innes, too, remembers.
That's a bit funny. We all had our haircuts and smarten up. The Magical Mystery Tour party, when Larry came out with his false tits and do his tap dances, John was, dressed as a rocker. It was come on, Larry, show us your tits. We've all seen them. It was just, I think secretly all people like Eric Clapton and.
Because he was God at that point, wasn't he?
No, he knew he wasn't God. I mean, that's just bad press,
But when Paul came to do the record. He knew what he wanted, and But he really didn't know. I mean, he's talking to the engineer and was trying to get some sort of verbiage going, but couldn't. You know, saying, well, when we did so-and-so, you know, we were in the red and doing this and pushing it, and we had a so-and-so, so-and-so. Do you know what that is? And the engineer said, no. And, you know, I don't know, but, you know, all this sort of thing. But he seemed to know the sound he wanted. And, I mean, the good thing about Paul doing the record was that everyone listened to him. We were all at loggerheads and we thought we had a good record, you know, urban, but no one knew quite how to do it. You know, we did one mix, another mix, and it was like 6 artists trying to paint a painting. So it was like, get Paul in because he's the only, if Paul said do it, we would all go, yes, sir, yes, Paul, no, sir. And everyone did, in fact, just shut up. And what he said went. You know what it's like. Well, if you're in recording studio, all the engineers are going, it's so boring what these guys are trying to do. You know, and they're all reading newspapers and thinking when they can go home. You know, I've heard this cut 1,000 times. And you know, there's this bass line going doom doom, and suddenly Paul went out in the studio and said, "Look, it's like this." And everyone went, "Wow, you know, get that down." You know, like they woke up because it was suddenly this was record, this was the music. I don't know what touch he had, but he was going, you know, this is how the line goes. But he wouldn't play it. You know, he said, no, you know. He played, in fact, the ukulele in the end. And it was very funny, Larry. I mean, Larry wanted to be seen next to Paul McCartney, you know, and we were in Bond Street because it was in Chapels. And I remember Paul saying, "Well, cheerio, lads, you know." It's great. I was saying, "Thanks very much," you know. And our manager was saying, "Oh, can we have a meal sometime, Paul?" And trying to sort of grease overflow, you know. Paul was saying, "No, look, I got to get off." And he was walking down the road, and Larry was still walking beside him, just not really talking about anything, but trying to say, "Paul McCartney, I'm walking next to him." You know. He carried on walking down Bond Street, and the rest of us just fell about in a heap laughing at Larry trying to be seen next to Paul McCartney. I mean, if Larry had had a photographer, he would have paid him £1,000 to take some pictures.
And Viv had met Paul McCartney in a club one night, because Viv was always one for the clubs and things, and was bemoaning, you know, our sorry plight in the recording business, because everyone in the business had rather enjoyed Gorilla, you know, people like, you know, Hendrix and Clapton, all those people, you know, we sort of rubbed shoulders with over the years. They'd all enjoyed that. And so Paul offered to produce Urban Spaceman. So he said, "You're on," you know. So the great day arrived, and the Magic Man arrived, and was very quick at putting everyone at ease. He sat down to the piano and said, "I've just written a song," and he was going, "Hey Jude, don't make it bad." And I'm looking at my watch and thinking, "Oh Christ, Paul, come on, maybe we need a ballad like this at a time like this. Can't we get on?" And only when the record came out did I realise, hey, that's what he played in the studio that day. Isn't it funny how you don't really listen? And but it was perfect, because when we got to make the thing, I mean, the manager was there and said, "Actually, we got somebody to help us out," and of course he couldn't. So Paul just got on the controls and whatnot.
You mean Mr. Vermouth?
Apollo C. Vermouth, yeah. And my manager's wife was, you know, quite a formidable lady. She said Paul was playing Viv's ukulele, and on the rhythm track. And afterwards, this lady said, "Oh, what's that you've got there? A poor man's violin?" He said, "No, a rich man's ukulele."
Ace drummer Legs Larry Smith offers up his memories of the grand occasion.
Viv rang Paul up and said, "Look, we've got this single. Would you come and produce it?" And he very kindly turned up one day, and we were all sort of nervous as hell, as you might imagine, sort of pacing up and down Chapels in London, Chapels recording studio. And he sort of slides in and sits down at the grand piano, and I guess to make us all feel wonderfully relaxed, he said, "I wrote this thing last night, see what you think?" And out came Hey Jude, and we were all standing around like some terrible Lawrence Welk show, you know, with elbows on the piano, on the grand piano, going, He said, "What do you think?" And we said, "Fine."
The White Album signaled the beginning of the end for the Beatles as a group. Although they were still working together, they were beginning to grow apart. The inevitable death knell had already been sounded. The band played on, unwilling troubadours at their own musical wake. Although not released until after Abbey Road, Let It Be was the next full-fledged Beatles project. A fine semi-live album, it also spun off into an intriguing motion picture documentary, and was even made into an excellent picture book. Of the many majestic works accomplished by McCartney, the song Let It Be is perhaps the most philosophically profound and moving. Some 2 decades after its release, Paul remembered the very personal inspiration behind the song.
I have this thing that I do which is kind of quasi-religious. I did it in Let It Be, where I talk about Mother Mary. In fact, the Mother Mary I'm talking about is my own mother. And that song happened because in the 60s, one night I was a bit sort of freaked out, as happened often in the 60s, those crazy days. He said, admitting everything. But, and I was a bit sort of freaked out, and I was having a dream, and my mother came to me. She died when I was 14. She came to me in this dream and sort of, she said, it's all right, kind of thing. And it really did make me feel a lot better when I woke up. So I wrote the song, in my darkest hour, Mother Mary comes to me.
The sessions for Abbey Road, meanwhile, began in earnest in July of 1969, with all 4 Beatles eager to bury the hatchet and get back to making music the way they once did, as a team. Throughout their career, the Beatles have left a number of happy accidents in their recorded works. From the famous clipped-off last note of Her Majesty to the self-admitted ambiguity of the lyrics of Hey Jude, these musical bloopers have now taken their place in Beatle lore, as Brother Mike recalls.
In the Beatle things, I used to make mistakes, and people would say, "Oh, I love that bit. Not the bit with the chip on your shoulder, whatever. Oh, fantastic!" But oh no, but that was. And in the end, he learned to shut up when he made a mistake, because that's the only thing that anybody remembered. So he thought, "Oh Christ, shut up."
Throughout the 60s, Paul McCartney dated actress Jane Asher. Although many felt here was a match made in heaven, ultimately it was not to be. Towards the end of his turbulent Jane Asher days, McCartney visited a clairvoyant in Brighton who told him that he would soon marry a blonde and have 4 children. By February of 1969, doctors confirmed that his new lady, Linda Eastman, was indeed pregnant. This convinced McCartney that he should at once cease playing house and make Linda his wife. To his utter amazement, the headstrong Miss Eastman at first declined. McCartney kept on pitching, and on March 11, 1969, the Apple press office announced the forthcoming nuptials. Paul and Linda's first child together was born at 1:30 a.m. on Thursday, August 29, 1969, at the Avenue Clinic in St. John's Wood. Weighing in at just 6 pounds 8 ounces, the beautiful baby quickly became Daddy's little girl, with her proud papa showing her off to the world on the cover of his now classic McCartney album. Although John started the group, as time went by he gradually relinquished the reins of power to Paul, who has hung on mightily ever since. For McCartney, the preservation of the Beatles' music, mystique, and lore is a life's work. Paul and Linda decided to get right back in the saddle and form a new group. Wings definitely was Paul McCartney's band. Whatever Paul wanted, he got. The feelings and opinions of those around him were largely incidental, especially when it came to allowing his bandmates to express themselves creatively. Always image-conscious, McCartney at least tried to appear interested in his colleagues' thoughts and feelings, but it was basically a sham. He would simply wait for the others to stop talking, and then generally would do exactly as he pleased. In 1990, while managing Denny Lane, we talked about his relationship with Paul and Wings in general. Paul eventually rang you and invited you, must have been around somewhere in 71, where he invited you to join Wings. Tell me about that phone call. Where were you and what happened?
Well, by this time I'd gone back to not working with, but living around my first manager, who was Tony Secunda. In other words, the Moody Blues manager. Without him, we wouldn't have made it, that's for sure. He was the ideas man. So I was kind of staying with Tony, and I was staying in the back room office, actually. There's a room off the office, and it was in a very expensive area in London, but, I was broke. And the phone goes, and as though he had, he'd been seeing me every day for the last 10 years, he says, "Hi, man, what you doing?" I said, "Who's that?" "Paul." "Paul who?" He went, "Paul, And then I sussed who it was. I said, "Well, what's happening?" He said, "Oh, well, I've just, I've done this album, Ram," as though he did, as though he didn't thought that I'd know he'd done an album, Ram. I said, "Yeah, I have heard about it. Yeah, go on." He says, "Well, I'm trying to put a band together, and the guys who did the album don't particularly want to do, put a band together, and he was being a little bit cagey, you know, didn't come straight out with it. And he said, the drummer wants to do it, but the others don't. And he said, do you fancy doing something? I said, yeah, fine. He said, well, I said, where are you? He said, Scotland. He said, meet Denny Sywell at the airport tomorrow. There'll be a ticket waiting for you. See you tomorrow.
Well, what actually happened when you got there?
Well, I mean, I was a little bit amazed that he was living, you know, in the back of Beyond in a very, very small farmhouse that he'd, I mean, obviously had started to work on. I think what had happened was when he was with Jane Asher, they'd bought this place, or he'd bought this place through, and I think he'd only ever seen it once. I don't think that she liked it too much, so they never went there again. But people had bought it for him as an investment. And he'd gone up there with Linda, she'd liked it, and they decided to settle there or use it in the summer. So it was kind of, you know, Paul McCartney living in I suppose what other people would call, you know, squalid, not squalid, but rough. Cheap surrounding, rough surrounding, which kind of appealed to me, you know. I like the fact that we can go and live any lifestyle and still work and get things together, and it's peaceful and it's away from prying eyes.
Was that the first time you'd met Linda McCartney? So what was your first, you know, impression there? Because obviously you read a lot about her.
Yeah, I liked her, you know, because I met her in that environment as like a mother, and she was doing the cooking, and you know, she said to me that she admired my work that I'd done with the Moody Blues, and also that she'd heard a Coca-Cola ad which we'd done, which she thought was pretty original, and you know, I mean, I got on very well with Linda all the way through.
When you first joined Wings, what were you doing? Just busking, sort of, to get your feet wet, playing Buddy Holly and stuff?
Well, yeah, whatever.
What was the daily schedule like up there, kind of thing?
Well, he had a little studio in the barn.
4-track, 8-track.
4-track that had, you know, obviously EMI had sent up some equipment for us to use. I'm not quite sure what the first thing we did, but I mean...
Well, Wildlife was the first album.
Yeah, so I mean, we were kind of... Those are some of the songs that Paul was working on, and as you know, there was Love is Strange was on there. So we were doing kind of a mixture of things, rehearsing-wise. That album came out of it, and again, that was just a very simple thing. I mean, we did actually do that in London, but we still did it very...
Where'd you record Wildlife?
EMI.
So the McCartney Lane songwriting partnership hadn't really... You were just basically playing and singing some backup?
Well, yeah, but I mean, obviously, you know, when you talk about writing, even though you don't get the credit for it, because normally it's like the music is written by one and the lyrics is written by another if you're collaborating. Well, in that case, you know, as far as like a top line would be written as far as the vocals concerned, and then the music would be written maybe just on a guitar or a piano. I mean, what you fill in, when you fill in the holes, you know, I'm contributing to that, obviously. So in that sense, arrangement-wise and ideas-wise, I was contributing, but I wasn't credited for that. But that goes for lots of things that I've done since as well.
Tell me about that first tour.
Well, we thought...
First tour, the college tour?
Yeah. So we decided that we wanted to play to a ready-made audience without advertising. Now, obviously colleges, you know, like they have on campus, they have residents, and you've got an audience. So wherever you go, you can just get there, announce it, and that night they're going to be there, right, without the press. So that was one of the reasons we picked universities.
So what did you do? You got a big caravan?
No, we got a little, like, mini bus, you know, 12-seater bus. And then we had a van with the equipment in, obviously. And we stayed in cheap hotels. We picked up the hotel when we got to the town. One night we were having fish and chips after the gig. The guy was a bit of an arsehole, the landlord. Because I suppose he didn't know who we were. We were just a group to him, just another band. But, you know, like all these out-of-town people, a lot of them are very greedy, and they'll take money off everybody and then moan at you afterwards. Anyway, we'd left some fish and chip papers or whatever. He'd cleaned away as much as you do, but what are you going to do? Leave it... You know, there's no bins in there, so we leave it on the bar or whatever. And he came down in the morning and was arguing, shouting at one of the roadies, and I mean, Paul was just so pissed off, and he still didn't say anything. Nobody knew that it was Paul McCartney, and I think Paul kind of, nudged him accidentally on purpose, just to sort of, oh, sorry, mate, because he was so fed up with this guy's attitude. I mean, he didn't hit him as such, but just kind of nicked him. And the guy was threatening to call the police and all sorts of things. I mean, if that guy ever to this day ever found out it was Paul McCartney, I don't know, but I hope he did, because then, it showed him up to be the arsehole that he was.
Well, how did people react when they thought they were getting, Ricky and the Red Stripes, and all of a sudden they got Paul McCartney?
I suppose there was a certain amount of, you've got to be joking, who are you trying to kid? But sure enough, they were there on the night, and we were there, and it went down great,
There was always that question, I know, right from the first days of Wings, really, to the very end, about what the hell Linda McCartney was doing there, other than the fact she was a nice lady, and, well, you've told me before, you've got nothing bad to say about her, but musically, I mean, what the hell was she doing there?
Well, in the main reason she was there is because she was sort of Paul's wife, and they wanted to be together. That's it. What can I say? If the fact that she couldn't play anything seemed to be immaterial to Paul, because he would teach her little things to do and teach her a few harmonies to do. Now, I always kind of resented it, because I felt that we could have been a better band a lot quicker if we'd have got a keyboard player.
Did she want to be in Wings at all?
Well, I think she wanted to be a part of it, yeah. As a photographer, influence, somebody who had something to say.
Linda was really slagged all through those years, but you said to me that, well, really, I don't have anything bad to say about Linda. So you really had a good relationship with her, didn't you?
Because I knew her. It's like if you see anybody from a distance, you don't. I mean, a lot of girls slagged her off because she married Paul McCartney, and death threats and all that sort of thing. Which, obviously, if they'd known her, there wouldn't be any of that. So, I mean, I knew her as a person. We got on very well together. We, we could talk to each other. She certainly wasn't an idiot by any, shake of the stick. She knew what she wanted, and she stuck to her guns. She reminded me a little bit of John Lennon, believe it or not, because she had that kind of attitude of, she believed a certain thing and nobody was going to change that, because she had information, and she did her homework to back it up. I mean, she's a vegetarian. He became a vegetarian. Now, some people laugh at that, but, if I'm around my missus and she wants to do something, I might say, I don't know about that to start with, but then eventually I see the value for me in that, and I will do it. And that's really what's kept them together. I mean, for a couple that's been together all these years and virtually inseparable.
Tell me that story when some guy said he was going to shoot Paul.
Yeah.
What was that?
Can't remember exactly where it was. I think it was Sweden. We were in a club which was next door literally to the hotel, so we didn't have to take any limos or any heavies with us. It was literally the next door, so we just walked in. And some guy Paul and Linda were in there already. Henry and I walked in, and Paul and Linda were looking very scared. And he said, some guys just threatened me with my life, he said he had a gun. So, partly because I don't know whether it was protection towards Paul or whether I was worried of getting shot as well. We had a little scam. Henry went one side of the club and I went the other, and we eventually moved seats until we got right next to this guy. Then we confronted him. He didn't have a gun. He was all apologetic and he was just trying it on, But of course, that could have been the opposite, so...
Your first single was Give Ireland Back to the Irish. You certainly started off with a bang of controversy. What's the story on that one?
Well, again, Paul was, quite innocently trying to solve a problem which can't be solved just overnight with a song like that. And obviously a lot of Irish people took umbrage to it, and it can be frightening. It's a little bit like another friend of mine who's a comedian who tells Irish jokes, and he's been threatened. Now, you know, all right, so I wasn't too keen on doing that as a song, to be honest, because of that. You know, I'm a little bit...
You anticipated there would be problems.
I anticipated there would be problems, yeah. Because it was a little bit naive of him, I thought, to write a song called Give Ireland Back to the Irish. Because, I mean, I certainly didn't know enough about the struggle and what the problem was to be able to write that. Maybe Paul did, I don't know, but he went ahead and wrote that song. As a result of it, we did get a lot of picketing, you know, at gigs and things. I mean, at one point I had to sort of put my toe down and drive through people, not knocking people over literally, but forcing them to jump out the way to get out. And I think even Henry's brother was beaten up or something in Southern Ireland as a result of it. So I mean, it's very difficult, you know, when you're writing songs about everything in life, not to be controversial, and you're obviously going to upset some group or some individual.
Setting off to Lagos, Nigeria to record the celebrated Band on the Run album, Paul, Linda and Denny were to experience the dramatic highs and lows of working in such an exotic locale, as Denny remembers.
You see, the way it came about is because here we were, the three of us, in fact, the two of us in the studio. We would go into the studio in Africa, and he had no facilities to speak of. I mean, all the stuff that, like the old washing machines that the EMI didn't want anymore, they had them there, right? You know, there was no facilities. Half the stuff was hanging out the walls, and nobody knew where to plug it in. It was good fun, but we had Jeff Emmerich, which was our engineer, who knew us. Okay, fortunately, he got us around the technical problems, but we had no musicians. Ginger Baker was trying to get us to use his studio, but then Paul felt that, you know, if we went there, we'd be too influenced by all that, you know, and the African thing would be too much. There'd be too many people wanting to come in and play on the album. So we stuck to the EMI place. He would sit there with an idea for a song, and I would learn it. Then I would play it on the guitar, and he would play drums, basically. Or he would play maybe piano, and I would play, you know, congas or percussion or guitar or tap a stick or whatever to get something from beginning to the end of the song.
It's really then a McCartney Lane album, isn't it?
Well, yeah.
Called Wings, but the two of you really.
Well, yeah. And then Linda would obviously be taught her little bits and come up with her harmonies afterwards. We then took the album back to London and added, obviously, the clarinets, the strings, you know, people like Brian Ferry would drop by in the studio. But we had the bed tracks because it was just me and Paul. So I mean, the beauty of that album, and to this day, everybody who says that is the greatest album, is the feel of it. So which proved that Paul and I had like a very, very sharp needle edge eye for what we wanted, you know.
While you were in Africa, however, a few interesting and sort of horrific things occurred. One was the robbery. Tell me about that.
Well, you know, out there you don't sort of have hotels. The companies, the big companies, the white community, 2% white community, they would own a certain amount of houses and a certain amount of Range Rovers and cars and chauffeurs and whatever, and we would lease these things. So we had houses, and I think Paul's was about a mile down the road from ours. And he was warned about we were all warned about going out after dark because there was lots of robberies there, and for robbery out there, because it's a military setup, they take the guys down to the beach and shoot them, you know, publicly. Execute them tied to a pole. So what are you laughing at? You like all that sort of thing. Because there would be, you know, the local pain in the arse, it hits a few old people over the head and never actually kills anybody, but it's always like robbing. And so eventually they'd just say, right, it's time for you to go, and they would shoot them. So in other words, it was just as much to their advantage if they were going to rob you to kill you, because then you couldn't recognise them in a lineup. So obviously don't go out late at night. So they thought, well, we don't listen to things like that, and they went out and walked from my place to their place. They were robbed. They had cameras, cassette players and whatever. Paul gave them everything, talked them out of it like he does, you know. and they let him go.
While in the U.S., apparently, the creative juices began to flow, with the band laying down not only the classic Junior's Farm, but also the obscure Jim McCartney instrumental, Walking in the Park with Eloise. While it's true that tensions among Wings' inner circle were at an all-time high during this period, the public had no idea of just how deep the wounds were. According to an undated MPL memo titled Fees for Artist Services, obtained in the research of this work, Paul's right-hand man, Denny Lane, while reasonably well paid for his creative input, took home nothing close to the millions of pounds his celebrated employer was steadily making off the band. By 1975, Lane was apparently doing a bit better, taking in a cool $100,000 for his work on Venus and Mars and the singles Listen to What the Man Said, Letting Go, and Rock Show. That summer, 1975, Wings rehearsed like demons in a derelict movie house in the nearby town of Rye for what Paul envisioned as a worldwide tour to end all tours. On October 28th, Wings jetted via Qantas Airlines to Australia. McCartney remembers this, Wings' first major international outing. We had fab fun. The audiences were great and we just dug playing. It was more like a holiday, really. So wildly successful were the concerts that tickets were being scalped in the underground for upwards of $500, or what McCartney playfully called Sinatra prices. Making their way back to England, Paul and the band booked themselves into Abbey Road in January of 1976 to begin working on their next album, later called Wings at the Speed of Sound. The idea of that LP, says Denny, was to try and showcase each member of the band. On September 12, 1977, Paul McCartney was at last granted his long-held secret wish for a son when James Lewis McCartney was delivered by cesarean section at a London nursing home, weighing in at 6 pounds 1 ounce. 8 days after the birth, the proud parents released an official photograph of this, the first male issue from Rock's royal family. Mull of Kintyre, the biggest-selling single in Great Britain, had its inception as a true joint effort between McCartney and Lane, as Denny told me back in 1989.
Mainly, my songwriting thing with Paul was really like Mull of Kintyre. We wrote that together, and that was like the biggest single ever in England. Now, if I'd have stayed around, I probably would have written a hell of a lot more with him. But I'd never really developed like an equal relationship songwriting-wise with Paul. But we knew that we had a good rapport songwriting-wise. But I wasn't as prolific as him. I didn't try to be a songwriter as much, you know. Paul and me are very folk influenced. We like folk music, right? We like kind of Scottish music, African, Moroccan, you name it, we're into it. And he was living in Scotland and he came up with this idea of a song called the Mull of Kintyre. But the Mull happens to be a peninsula in Scotland. That's what they call it. A mull is a word for a peninsula. And this particular area was called Kintyre, the county of Kintyre. You know, the province of Kintyre, whatever, the state of Kintyre. And the Mull was where the lighthouse was. And it was the worst shithole in the world that you would ever visit. You know, you wouldn't visit there with your worst mother-in-law, you know what I mean? Yeah. You wouldn't take her there. So, it was a hole. All it had was a lighthouse and a cemetery, you know, and a shitty kind of hotel where we had to stay. The band stayed there. But anyway, he wrote this song called The Mull of Kintyre. So we bought in he didn't write the song, he wrote like the lyric, Mull of Kintyre. In actual fact, he wrote the chorus, which is the selling point, so you can't say I was responsible for that. And he came to me with this thing, this verse, or whatever it was, and I said, I love that. And he went, oh really? He hadn't got any great ideas to do anything with it. I said, I love that. And that would be fantastic with the Campbelltown Pipe Band sort of thing, maybe. Also, you know, I injected my enthusiasm and his eyebrows went up. So that kind of one of the days shortly after that, we met to finish it off. And we did. We drank a bottle of scotch. and Coke, because Paul's never been a big drinker, but he likes his Scotch and Coke. So we got through a bottle during the course of a day, sitting on the wall outside the cottage, and I kind of threw, you know, most of the lyrics of the verses in, which he would finish off, and we'd throw things in, throw them away, whatever. And then we got the pipe band in, and because we'd done it in a certain key and their drone was in a D, we did it in A, their drone was in a D, but they couldn't come in for the first verse, so we brought them in as a feature, which really gave it the lift, which we wouldn't have, that was the bit of magic of that song. And then we transposed down halfway through, so the song had a real form that we hadn't anticipated, and turned into a bit of magic. And in actual fact, what used to crack me up is that people from all over the world used to visit the Mull of Kintyre thinking it was this fantastic place, and it was a shithole. And the name Mull of Kintyre stuck, and they now call the whole area the Mull of Kintyre, and it never existed before. So, you know, we've made some kind of mark in history.
By January 12, 1980, Paul McCartney felt on top of the world. Springing back mentally after the relative failure of both Back to the Egg and Wings' recent British tour, he was ready to take on the world, flying to New York aboard the Concorde on his way to a long-awaited engagement in Japan. After a brief 4-day visit with Linda's dad and an aborted attempt to see John Lennon, the McCartneys checked out of their luxury suite at the Stanhope Hotel and boarded a TWA jumbo jet bound for Tokyo's Narita International Airport. Landing in Tokyo 14 exhausting hours later, Paul and Linda emerged from the aircraft all smiles, thrilled to finally be playing Japan. Inside the customs hall, they were greeted by a hail of flashing cameras, all zeroed in on the great man, lugging little James in one arm as he mugged predictably for the delighted media. As they stepped up to the long, low inspection counter, a customs officer indicated to the couple to open their carry-on luggage. Sitting inside what has been widely reported as Linda's overnight case was a small, fist-sized plastic bag, obviously containing several ounces of primo pot. When the fellow pulled it out of the suitcase, said Paul, he looked more embarrassed than me. I think he just wanted to put it back and forget about the whole thing, you know, but there it was. A senior officer pushed his way out from behind and immediately ordered the pop star detained. He then radioed for the Narcotics Control Bureau to come and get their man. Steve Holley, Wings' latter-day drummer in its final feeble incarnation, spoke to me about the infamous drug bust in a rare 1983 interview in New York.
We were all there at the same time. I'd flown in from London and he'd flown in from New York, and we were already checked through customs and sitting on the bus waiting for him to get onto the bus, and because he never did. We didn't know at the time. We were just told at the airport that there was a complication and that we were to go on to the hotel and that we'd be meeting up later. So I went to the hotel. I was very tired. It's like an 18-hour flight, and checked into my room and went to sleep, and got woken by Linda at 7:30 in the evening, who was kind of like laughing nervously and saying, hey, you know, Paul's been busted. I said, and because she was laughing, I thought she was kidding around. So I just said, yeah, great, Linda, I'll see you for dinner, you know, and left it at that, and just got up and had a shower and got dressed and went down to the bar. And there was a great deal of MPL staff sitting around with faces forlorn expressions, and a lot of kind of plainclothes police everywhere and fans going crazy, and I realized that she was telling the truth.
To the morally conservative Japanese, McCartney's transgression was indeed a serious matter. On the 9th day of Paul's incarceration, the powers that be decided that he had had enough punishment, and so cut a deal with McCartney's legal staff to release the rock star. Ever the politician, Paul insisted on touring the facility and personally greeting each of the prisoners, which he did, passing his hand through the small iron doors of their cells just to say sayonara. Mike, too, remembers the strain on everyone caused by Paul's unexpected detention in a Tokyo jail.
Yeah, he's a bugger for punishment. There's an old Liverpool joke, that.
Isn't it going to screw up his immigration soon when he wants to travel?
Might do, yeah.
Just think of it. There was.
Oh, I've thought of it. He was in a Japanese prison cell. We were very worried about the Jap business, though. The family, we were worried in Liverpool. And one of your own's incarcerated in a Japanese prison cell. You worry, you know. You've only seen the war films. And you worry, you know. They may be little, but they got bloody big swords.
For Denny Lane, the bust was both the end of his term with Wings and, unfortunately, his brotherly friendship with Paul, as he explains.
I left because he got busted in Japan. Now, we'd been waiting for 5 years to get there. One reason was the fact that we couldn't do the tour. That was the biggest upset of the lot.
Whatever McCartney thinks privately about pot, in public he has taken a fairly rigid anti-drug stance. Listen to these comments made recently at a press conference in Tokyo.
Yeah, well, you know, what I tell my own children, I've got 4 children, but I talk to them about drugs or any kind of stimulants. I advise them that the best thing to do is to be straight and stay natural and don't use any drugs or stimulants or booze or anything, you know. But, you know, having said that, it is a difficult world we live in, and people get into things like alcohol and drugs and stuff. So, I mean, I'd advise anyone, if they listen to my advice, to stay straight. You know, that's the advice. As to whether they'll listen to me, that's another matter.
In a 1980s press conference, George Harrison had these thoughts on his former partner, Paul.
But, yeah, I think Paul definitely was in a rut. In a ruttle. And yeah, I think it's good that he should work with various people, and hopefully he'll find somebody who will actually tell him something, you know, because most people work with Paul and they're afraid to just say anything to him. And I think that's no good. You need to have somebody you can work with who will tell you you're no good when you're no good. Otherwise, it's no help at all. Paul had suggested maybe the chance of me and he writing together something. And, I mean, it's pretty funny, really, because, I mean, I've only been there about 30 years in Paul's life, and it's like now he wants to write with me. But I think it's maybe quite interesting sometime to do that.
Throughout the 80s, Paul McCartney experienced a series of dramatic happenings in a lifetime already chock-a-block with extraordinary moments, some good and some very, very bad. Obviously, the December 8, 1980 murder of John Lennon was almost unbearable for the sensitive composer-performer. But fortunately, things soon even out for Paul, starting with the April 1981 marriage of Ringo Starr to actress Barbara Bach in London. The November 1982 beginning of principal photography for his something less than miraculous cinematic debut for Give My Regards to Broad Street. McCartney's induction into the coveted Freedom of the City Honours in Liverpool in November of 1984, his stirring appearance at Live Aid on July 13, 1985, Paul's collaboration with fellow Liverpool rocker Elvis Costello in 1987, the release of a rocking collection of classic 50s numbers exclusively for the Russian market in 1988, and finally, the inception of the Paul McCartney World Tour, which kicked off in Oslo, Norway on September 26, 1989. As was Paul's custom, he met the press for a lively give and take at nearly every stop along the way. What follows then is a montage of some of the highlights of Paul's witty and often compelling repartee from that time.
We had a few options of where to finish the tour, and this was the most exciting. I always like Chicago. It's one of my cities, you know. You know, hey man, I'm telling you. I think, you know, because this has been a big sort of tour on the heels of the Stones and stuff, people tend to think, oh, this is bound to be his last tour, you know. And my great venerable age would suggest this kind of thing. But I've actually had a great time on this tour, and the band's got better and better. So we're putting a live album out from this tour, and we got a film, and then we'll make a new studio album. And I would like to think that after that we'll come back on tour. We started off the tour thinking it'd be a good idea to support people like Friends of the Earth. And as you know, we've supported them basically through the whole tour. And it's been really good, you know, because all we were doing was bringing publicity to the issues. You know, I'm not an expert. And apparently Friends of the Earth have got like a lot of new members. And the kind of things I notice are when I see a kid who says, I just did a class lecture to all my school friends about Friends of the Earth, about ecology, and we used your program to get all the facts, you know. So it's having some effect. It's great. And then later on there's the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA. I just believe in all that stuff, you know, so I'm happy to give them publicity.
What can you do to help? I think, if you think about joining things like Friends of the Earth or Greenpeace or PETA, any of these organizations, they're very good at telling you what you can do. You'll hear people talking about recycling and all that sort of stuff. Well, that's all brilliant. It's all very good. And I think, just believe. That's the main thing. Believe the world needs saving, and you'll save it. We were lucky. We got into rock and roll, and the great thing that happened with us was national service, which was going into the army in England, stopped. So we were able to have the Beatles and have our success. I think we wouldn't have had that had it not been for that. If I hadn't have gone into rock and roll, I think the nearest thing I could ever think to do was like to be a teacher, because that was kind of where I was heading. I don't think I would have been a very good one. So, thank God for rock and roll. When I wrote Fool on the Hill, the idea for me was always just someone who's got the right answer, but people tend to ridicule him. Whether he's a little guy sitting in a cave or on the top of a hill, or whether he's an activist. And so I was looking for a speech from somebody like that, and I think probably the greatest recorded speech in that vein is the Martin Luther King speech. So moving and so dramatic, and we found that it fitted exactly in the piece of music that we had, a little solo in Fool on the Hill. So it was great. It's quite a stirring thing to put in. I don't think I'm getting into folk really. But I'm not really bothered what it's labeled. Some of the stuff I do, people can dance to, but you wouldn't call it dance music. Some of it may be a bit folksy. I mean, the most folksy thing we ever did was a Scottish thing called Mulla Kintyre, which is, hey, you're not supposed to know about that. It was only a hit in England. Well, anyway, but that was good fun, but I don't particularly think I'm going in any one direction. I just go in whatever direction seems good at the time. It interests me, I don't mind. I always like a good selection of stuff. So rap isn't my field, but I like it. I like to watch it on TV and stuff and listen to it. I like a lot of modern music. I think it's good. I like dance music. It's not particularly what I do, and I think that kind of in radio over here puts me in like sort of adult contemporary. Because at the end of the Beatles, I used to really dread that question, because they'd say to me, "Are you happy?" and I'd sort of say, "Yes," and break down, because it wasn't much fun, it was very difficult to know what you were going to do in life, but because it's a hard act to follow, the Beatles. But I've done pretty well since that, and with this kind of a tour and stuff, I'm really happy. I got a great family, a great band, and we seem to be selling some tickets along the line. I don't really think about, roles and stuff. I just would like to continue making music. I want to get better. That's always my goal. So hopefully, if the next album's better than the last one, that's really all that interests me. I don't really think of myself as any kind of role model or anything. It's just not the way I think. Well, I never really mean to be kind of political. My main thing is just to be a musician. But in 1989, when we started this tour, this big hole appeared over the Antarctic, 50-mile hole, and I think, like the young lady who asked the question before, it worries people. I normally at these conferences I'll ask anyone who's not worried about the future of the Earth and the ecology to put their hands up, please. But normally, obviously most people you'll meet are worried about it, and really all I'm doing is giving publicity to that cause. And I think it's a very good cause. And I also feel very optimistic about it, that with the help of these young people, we're going to turn it round.
In the early 90s, McCartney surprised pop fans by teaming up with a noted composer to pen the generally well-reviewed Liverpool Oratorio. McCartney commented on the experience and his innate love of classical music during a 1990s press conference in his hometown of Liverpool.
When I wrote Eleanor Rigby, I remember thinking, well, what am I going to do when I'm 30? That's very old, 30. And I did have this image of myself maybe moving into this kind of thing. Well, it's taken till now, more like 50 than 30, to actually get to grips with it. I suppose it was because I was asked by the Philharmonic to do it that made the final decision.
One of the most impressive aspects of Paul and Linda's life these days is their philosophical commitment to ethical vegetarianism. McCartney remembers the couple's sudden shift to this more compassionate lifestyle. During the course of a Sunday lunch, we happened to look out of the window at our young lambs racing happily in the fields. Glancing down at our plates, we suddenly realized we were eating the leg of an animal that had until recently been gamboling in a field itself. We looked at each other and said, "Wait a minute. We love these sheep. They're such gentle creatures, so why are we eating them?" It was the last time we ever did. As time passed and the issue of animal protection became even more volatile and imperative, Paul and Linda both significantly stepped up their efforts on behalf of not only edible livestock, but research animals as well. At the risk of being called radical, late in 1990, they even went so far as to record a series of messages on behalf of PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, which were played to callers on a special 800 number throughout North America. The Beatles' all you need is love philosophy had finally and forever blossomed in James Paul McCartney's heart. It had been a long and winding road.
Yes. What can you say about Brian?
Epi, he was my dad originally. There's a book come out on me, and I only looked to just flick through it. And there was one quote where he says, "Don't get in with Jew boys," or something. It's exactly the opposite of what my dad said. He said, "Get a good Jewish manager. They're very good with business." It's real Liverpool attitude, real working class attitude. And he said that. So we did eventually, and Brian came down the cabin and all that story. I think people know that bit. We liked him. We thought he was good. His gay bit never really entered into it, as far as we were
Something you
concerned.
didn't hear about until after he died, really, isn't it?
Oh, no, we heard about it.
I mean, the
public wouldn't. No, we knew about it from the off. He didn't make any secret of it. And, you had to be daft to not sort of see the kind of people he was around and stuff. So you kind of knew he was gay. But it never interfered. It never entered. It was his world.
Being so polite and
He was lovely, man. He was a lovely man, Brian. I think of his faults, I used to say, use a word he hated. I used to say he was a little bit green. But I think it was true. I think the deals, the Lennon McCartney songs weren't our copyrights and things like that. It was very naive when you know what you know now. The deals were very naive.
That's experience, isn't it?
It's the business acumen. He had that to a degree, but his thing was the flair. And also, I always say, the people he introduced us to. We came down here, we were meeting people like Larry Gelbart, who's the writer of MASH, even to this day. And it was a class of people. It was an artistic class of people that I don't think we would have got in with otherwise. We were meeting like the actress Coral Brown. I don't know why I think of these odd examples, but it's a level. And he kind of gave us an intro into that. So I don't think people should belittle that aspect of it. I think, probably lots of faults, but I liked him. He was a lovely guy.
Are you a Beatle collector?
Yeah, odds and sods. I'm not really a very good thorough one, because I haven't got all the records, for instance, which is daft. I really ought to have all of them. But I get odds and sods. I've got some great little things. I've got my bass with a little list still on it. As we open with rock and roll music, the gig list, which is still taped to it after many, many years. I've got my Sgt. Pepper coat. I've got the first record we ever made, which is great. So I've got bits and pieces,
Jeffrey, is
great
supposed
bits
to be
and
one
pieces.
of America's biggest collectors.
Is he?
And he was very interested to know what
I've got. Well, I've got, a bunch of stuff, Jeffrey. Leave it at that, shall we, son?
Right, good.
I think we'll have to wrap up now. They're all just screaming, and with our tape thing, we're an hour over. So, good night, everybody, and all the little birds and Daddy Bird. See you, and rock on. Bye.
Right.
Say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Jeffrey Giuliano is the author of some 30 internationally best-selling books on the Beatles, John Lennon, and other iconic musicians of the 1960s. In 2006, his book, Paint It Black, The Murder of Brian Jones, was made into a film by Stephen Woolley and Nick Powell entitled Stoned, The Wild and Wicked World of Brian Jones. It remains a cult classic and the only film bio of the Rolling Stones. Giuliano is also a veteran journalist, having written for dozens of high-profile newspapers and magazines, including The Sunday People, The Daily Mail, The News of the World, The Mail on Sunday, Playgirl, and Rolling Stone. A noted film actor, Giuliano starred in such movies as Vikingdom, Scorpion King 3, Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, The Fifth Execution, Far Cry 3, Fire Desire, among many. In addition, he hosted the long-running North American syndicated radio series, Jeffrey Giuliano's Roots of Rock, for 5 years, as well as pioneering the audiobook industry in the 1990s by authoring, narrating, and producing over 250 original, non-book-based, interview-driven productions. Giuliano's publishers included Random House, HarperCollins, Delta Entertainment, Durkin Hayes, Playaway Audio, Speechworks, and B&B Audio, among dozens more internationally. In 1998, Random House acquired his firm Tribute Audio, for which Giuliano acted as CEO and publisher for 5 years. His best-selling audiobook, That Fateful Night, True Stories of Titanic Survivors in Their Own Words, was nominated for a Grammy. In 2014, Jeffrey Giuliano founded Icon Editions and G2 Media Arts to market his updated works as well as publish new projects. As a visual artist, Jeffrey has been showing in galleries across America since 1977, garnering impressive reviews. His first professional assignment was designing several T-shirts for The Who's Pete Townsend in 1976. Jeffrey also designed and illustrated many of his original rock biographies for the biggest publishers in the world from 1984 to 2006, as well as designing for his pioneering record label, Samba Records, in the mid-1990s. From 2006 to 2011, Jeffrey was also the primary designer for the French fashion house Cotai. When Giuliano first conceived of creating his own literary imprint, Icon Editions, he became responsible for illustrating and designing 35 book covers, several hundred CDs, DVDs, as well as dozens of promotional posters, and eventually an entire collection of exclusive fashion and art. The expansive Design by Giuliano brand grew out of Jeffrey's impressive commitment to the arts and is the culmination of a lifetime's work by an extraordinarily talented and determined Renaissance man.